Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, and Terminal Philosophy. We're discussing the Chauvin Trial and its broader relationship within the defunding the police movement of contemporary America. So just briefly, if you would, Keith, maybe you could sketch out the George Floyd incident and then the trial itself of Chauvin.
Well, what appears to have happened from the most reliable accounts is that George Floyd went into a convenience store in Minneapolis and he attempted to buy something and he passed a counterfeit $20 bill. And there was some kid working behind the counter who noticed this was a counterfeit. And he called George Floyd on it, in part because they had a policy at the store that if you accept a counterfeit bill, it comes out of your pocket. So the kid didn't want to have to cover the loss himself. So some of the employees of the store followed Floyd outside and were asking him to pay for whatever he purchased or make good on what he owed the store. And apparently he was not agreeable to that. Along the way, someone called the police. I believe it was the same kid who was the cashier that accepted the false bill initially. George Floyd and a friend were getting into his vehicle when the police showed up. Originally, it was not Chauvin that showed up. It was two other cops that showed up. And they were, getting into a confrontation with Floyd. And then Chauvin and another cop showed up. And the situation escalated. Floyd was apparently intoxicated, gave the appearance of being intoxicated. So the police were in a situation where that not only did they have someone that was suspected of passing a counterfeit currency, but also driving under the influence or about to drive under the influence. So the police tried to get Floyd out of his car. He was resistant to that. And then the whole process escalated. People around the situation started to show up and pull out their phones and record the event. Some of the bystanders were arguing about the cops, arguing with the cops, saying that they were mistreating Floyd. They tried to arrest George Floyd. They tried to put him into a police vehicle. He was complaining that he was claustrophobic. They handcuffed him eventually, and they had him on the ground. And that's really where the problem started, because when they had Floyd handcuffed and on the ground, apparently Derek Chauvin kept his knee on the man's neck or back. It's disputed about where the pressure really was. Was it really on his neck or his back? But he kept the man down on the pavement for about almost 10 minutes, something like 9.5 minutes. And somewhere in there, George Floyd died. It looks like he died about 6 minutes in. And the general assessment of the coroners and pathologists and other medical experts is that George Floyd died because through asphyxiation, essentially, because of the impact of the pavement on his chest from one end and the weight of Chauvin on the other end. It cut off his breathing. He also had various other medical issues, a heart condition or a breathing condition or something or other. And he had a drug habit as well. He used drugs that are known to be respiratory suppressant, like fentanyl and opiates. So along the way, he died. And the issue with Chauvin, the reason he was charged with murder, was because the method of restraint that he was using was, first of all, considered unnecessary because he had the Floyd handcuffed and on the ground. So they weren't in a fight or Floyd wasn't resisting arrest at that point. Also, the method of restraint that was being used was not authorized by the police department's policies. And then Chauvin couldn't at that point claim that he was in danger or his life was being threatened because Floyd was down on the ground and pretty much been subdued at that point. And then he kept his body weight pressure on Floyd while Floyd was saying he couldn't breathe and was asking for help. And then people on the street were saying that that Chauvin needed to get off of Floyd, and that he was in trouble, having medical difficulty. There was a mixed martial arts expert that was there that was pointing this out. And all of this was brought up during the trial. They had testimonies from the eyewitnesses there that observed the whole scene. They had medical experts, including those involved in the autopsy, as well as general experts who specialize in these kinds of cases. And then they had police, including members of the Minneapolis Police Department, the chief of police, and others, who said that what Chauvin did was not authorized by policy and so ultimately that's how Chauvin ended up getting convicted of the charges. He was convicted of killing someone in a way that couldn't be considered self-defense, or was not did not involve legally authorized police work or authorized by their particular party.
All right. Now, as to the actual trial itself, I didn't really watch that, so I guess I'll ask some of you guys. Swithun, what are your thoughts on the actual conviction itself?
Well, I saw parts of it. The whole demeanor of the trial. Now, don't hold me to this in court, because I didn't see a huge amount of it. But the whole tenor of the entire trial seemed to be, well, I suppose one could rename the show trial the Chauvin Trial, given the whole way it carried on. It seems clear that the police departments and everyone literally just wanted to throw him under a bus to get him out of the way, to not be a problem to the police departments in any way, shape, or form. Even so, as the yeoman has pointed out in the chat, that the medical examiner that the defense used to Dr. David Fowler, ex-Maryland chief medical examiner, said that Floyd died as heart disease, drug use, and CO2 exposure. And so much so now that they're going to review the last 17 years of this guy's work, because he has the temerity to claim that St. George wasn't killed by Chauvin. It also seems like the response to the trial is interesting. It's like, oh no, now we've made steps in racial justice. How the great result has happened. And you know that the entire media would have gone about, if Chauvin had been acquitted, it would have been the case, or had minor charges, like, I don't know, actual bodily harm or something like that. That, oh no, how evilly racist all the jurors are, etc., etc. It was almost like a religious ceremony. It's basically a scapegoating escapade. This is equivalent to Old Testament ritual. It is a very odd, and now we'll probably get this later. I don't think any of them on here are particular fans of the police, but if this is the way that trials can go, well, that's not looking very good for any actual justice taking place. I think that would be my initial reaction.
All right, Terminal Philosophy, your reaction on the guilty verdict.
Sure. Well, I think, with the widening cultural divisions in the United States, it's difficult to imagine that Derek Chauvin ever had a chance at a fair trial, regardless of whatever your opinion on the trial might be, because the consequences of the charges being dropped, or any verdict that would not have reflected public opinion, would have probably meant some kind of a repeat of summer of 2020. There's an interesting thing going on here with with trials like this, where on one hand you have the actual legal proceedings, the consideration of evidence on the part of the prosecution and the defense, and then you have this more nebulous and hyperbolic media and public reaction or ruminations about the trial. And it would appear that Chauvin's trial, or at least in part the outcome of the trial, was influenced by the media, journalism, social media, and so forth. Now, as for some of the specifics, it appears that the jury, I mean, among other things, especially social media, which we can get into in a little bit, it went by sort of the legal analysis of one of the prosecuting witnesses, Dr. Tobin, who stipulated that Floyd died from some type of not strangulation, but some type of asphyxiation type of a thing. And so Dr. Tobin's testimony doesn't seem to interface with much of the autopsy information at all. And so he allegedly had, now George Floyd allegedly had about 3 times the amount of lethal fentanyl in his system in a partially blocked artery. And so there's so much going on here, but I mean, I tend to agree with Swithun that I mean, this was in part very much a sort of religious ceremony, because it was, I mean, it was just in the atmosphere of a foregone conclusion. I think on the part of manslaughter, manslaughter was probably the most easily provable charge, because all the jury would have to do, or all the prosecution would have to prove, was some sort of element of recklessness. So that charge absolutely seemed to be a foregone conclusion. I think I'll just leave that initially at that, and then we can talk about some of the public and the media reactions to that here in a moment.
Yeah, I think a couple of points bear witness. Whatever someone's view is about whether Chauvin should be considered guilty or not, when it comes to the publicization of trials, one of the things that a lot of people tend to overlook, and I think a good movie reference would be Man for All Seasons, where the main character, Thomas More, is arguing with a prospective son-in-law over the rights of the law, and he said he would give the rights of the law to the devil himself. And his prospective son-in-law says, "Well, why not just root out the heretics any way you can?" And he's like, "Well, if we do that, then by the time Satan comes for us, we'll have nothing to appeal to. We'll have no law to appeal to, and we'll be done in by the same system that we built up." And I think a lot of people on the left don't see that and need to be reminded of that the methods that they're using will be used against them, and they have been in the past, even if it gets them the kind of outcome that they want. And you mentioned already terminal philosophy, the influence of the media, and more importantly, social media, which does turn, well, it's a part of the broader, the personal is political, right? If everything is political, right, the classic conception of Western jurisprudence is the law is blind, which has, Lady Justice blindfolded with a sword and a scale. But what we see now is that law is not blind anymore. And part of the reason why it's not blind is because it's political, and it's political in large part because of the media and social media. And you might get the verdict you want at the moment because you're able to generate enough popular support for it. But by the same token, when it's used against you, as Moore said in the film, you don't really have any leg to stand on, and then you're just as vulnerable as anyone else. So I think that is a worrying trend to see how the politicization of law has become accepted. That's not to say that cases in the past were not political or politicized. Big profile cases can be that way, but there was a general assumption that the law had to sort of fight against that. You couldn't just bow to the mob, bow to the crowd. You still had to put up some semblance of the machinery of justice. But it's becoming, I think, clear that it's increasingly less and less interest. The people who are dispensing the justice are less and less interested in keeping up to the rules and forms of it, but rather are campaigning for partisan purposes. And that's not just to paint the left that way. I think the right can do that as well. It's just the new game we live in, the new world we live in. What are some of your thoughts on all of this, Keith?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because my own bias is that whenever a cop gets into a scuffle with a civilian, I tend to instinctively root for the civilian. But then when a cop gets put on trial, then the cop becomes a defendant whom the state is coming down on. So I tend to, at least to a point, tend to root for the cop in many ways. So in a situation like that, I do think that one of the biggest jokes of all is that in this particular situation, the idea that this was somehow an impartial trial or any of that kind of thing. I know at one point there was talk about jury sequestering. In fact, Chauvin's lawyer, that Eric Nelson fellow, he was saying that he had wanted the jury to be sequestered, but I mean that would have served no purpose because everybody on earth knows who Derek Chauvin is. I mean, unless they don't have television or internet or have been asleep for the last year or something like that or in a coma. So there was really no way to get a totally blind jury going into this case. I mean, I'm sure everyone on the jury had some idea what the case was already about. I do think there was an element of intimidation as well. One of the alternate jurors that was involved with this case came out and said that she was worried that if Chauvin was not found guilty, that there would be more rioting and looting and that kind of stuff. She lives in Minneapolis where this is a real issue. So I do think there's an element of intimidation there. I do think that certainly there was a great deal of pressure by the media, by the political establishment, by lots of people to find Chauvin guilty because, and in a way, I think what's happening here is that they're kind of throwing this guy under the bus in order to exonerate the wider system. That's one thing that the prosecutor really emphasized. Was that this is not about putting the system on trial. This is not about putting the police on trial. This is about one man, a bad actor, a rogue cop who committed a crime. And in that way, I think it's about just reinforcing the legitimacy of the system, saying, oh, well, look, we had this bad cop. He did a bad thing. We put him on trial. We convicted him of murder. What's the problem? The system works. There's an element of that. Also, if we look at political intimidation, we actually had Maxine Waters showing up in Minneapolis threatening to incite riots if Chauvin was not convicted. I mean, she doesn't even represent that area in Congress. She represents Southern California. We see that element. So, yeah, I mean, another figure involved was Keith Ellison, who was the Attorney General of Minnesota. He's more or less supervised the prosecution from behind the scenes. This is a person who's very political. He's fairly leftward leaning. He's thought to have, some people think he has presidential ambitions. This was a very politicized case. And I do agree with the comments about due process. Increasingly, we're starting to see an issue where due process is considered illegitimate or only peripheral legitimacy if it's a politically charged case. What I mean by that is, here's an example. Increasingly, we see when it comes to the issue of sexual assault, we see this slogan, "We believe women," or whatever. That came up during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings and all that kind of stuff. Well, to apply that to any other case and see the problem with it, all you would have to do is look at, say, an armed robbery case. Well, we believe convenience store clerks who get held up, or we believe car owners who are victims of carjacking or something like that. The idea is, will you believe an alleged crime victim if there's evidence that they've actually been victimized by a crime, not just based on their social identity of some kind. Now, in the past, of course, we could say, well, sexual assault cases may have been swept under the rug, or cases involving the mistreatment of black people may have been swept under the rug. But then it can also go the other way. You can have bias in any kind of direction, and you can have politically charged cases that are involved in the denial of due process and in different kinds of ways. Now, of course, none of this has anything to do with whether Derek Chauvin should have actually been convicted of murder. I actually talked to a guy I know who was a criminal defense attorney. In fact, he has defended capital cases before, capital murder, death penalty cases. And he said that in Virginia, Chauvin could have potentially been charged with first-degree murder, which is an even more serious crime than what he was charged with. So it's not really a question of whether he's guilty according to however the law would define guilt, but there is an element of politicization here that I think is interesting.
Yeah, and I think the really interesting element here about this entire case and the Defund the Police movement is that for my entire adult life, the last 20 years, the radical left in its anti-globalist, anti-state critique, has mentioned that, for example, Noam Chomsky famously stated on numerous occasions that the corporation is total tyranny because there's no voice of appeals in a corporate structure. You just orders go down and you just do them. And he says he's an anarchist. He doesn't want to abolish the state because the state is theoretically, in its current iteration, responsive to the democratic will of the people. And so, well, we'll keep that as long as we can as a hedge against corporations, which are total tyranny, until we can get to a better system. And I think a lot of left-wing anti-globalists took that Chomskyite line. But what we see is a complete reversion of that. Because by that logic, however bad the police are going to be a heck of a lot better than the National Guard, the Army, and Blackwater security forces. And yet, what do we see with the left? They've accepted completely, by their own rhetoric, total tyranny, total oppression, which is corporate and statist military control over the streets. And, this reminds me of the line from Revenge of the Sith, where Padme says, "So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause." Exactly. The left is applauding this. And during the Chauvin trial, who was guarding the courthouse? It was the National Guard. It wasn't the police. And of course, having the National Guard deployed like that is the very dictionary definition of martial law. From Merriam-Webster's dictionary, the law administered by military forces that is invoked by a government in an emergency when the civilian law enforcement agencies are unable to maintain public order and safety. Now, in 1878, there was the Posse Comitatus Act, which was passed, which happened at the end of Reconstruction, saying that you could not use the military except in very specifically defined emergency situations to do law enforcement in any part of the country. And what really is incredible now is we're reaching a point where Posse Comitatus is a dead letter, where there really is no limit to military deployment on the streets. In fact, people seem to welcome it. It's this really weird Twilight Zone world where people are welcoming the National Guard and the police and private security as local law enforcement. If you were to ask anybody on the street, they'd say, well, we don't live in martial law. I mean, I guess I don't even know what the dictionary definition of martial law is, but we live in martial law. And the people that I would have thought would have been the most vocal at criticizing this is the left. And they're completely silent on the matter. In fact, well, no, they're not silent. They're cheering. They're cheering at the, because what they view the Chauvin trial as is a sort of moral victory over the police force in their war to abolish it. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think any of us here, like you said, Swithun, are huge fans of the police. But I'd rather have a police chief that we can vote on than, the National Guard, the Army, or private security forces like Blackwater, using their drones to patrol the street with robot dogs. I mean, that's a huge step down from where we're at now. And again, it's just unbelievable. Now, there is one old school leftist, I think it was Naomi Wolf, who still sort of takes this position. I think she talked to Tucker Carlson recently about this, and apparently all the left hates her now because she didn't change. She just stayed the same, apparently. But I mean, she is one of those leftists that did stick to that interpretation. And well, I think that's the real question here. What explains this shift? It's a very recent shift in the last 10 years, and maybe it's too recent for anybody to have a holistic analytical breakdown. But I think one thing that's clear is social media and education is a part of it. But that would only explain millennials. That doesn't explain why diehards like Chomsky and all these other guys have totally flipped. And that's, I think, a much harder question to answer because they have decades upon decades of resisting this. And now they're just embracing the corporate system because it's quote unquote woke, which I think proves the point that I've been saying all along, is that ID poll is not revolutionary at all. It's just a corporatist scam to divide everything up. I mean, if you want to take that revolutionary route that so many leftists say they want to, well, then socialism is all about uniformity, sameness. If you're all special snowflakes, expressing your own sexual identity, that's not a way to build socialism by definition, because you need conformity and uniformity to do that. And so what it was is I think partly it was a hack. Now, ID poll issues had always been a part of the left, black versus white, women versus men, but the corporations kind of, I think, weaponized it. And that explains it, but in part. But I think the real takeaway is that we do live, it's not hyperbolic at all to say that we don't even live in a police state. We live in a martial law state where the army and private security is just going to be the name of the game, which is a loss for anybody that purports to be anti-establishment, anti-authoritarian, left-wing libertarian, or whatever. So we'll open up with you, Keith. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think this is what's actually happening with this. The left in the United States has long preferred federal law enforcement over local law enforcement. And one of the main reasons for that is they associate local law enforcement with guys like Bull Connor, like these redneck sheriffs in the South back in the 50s and 60s that would sick dogs on civil rights protesters or look the other way when vigilantes lynched a black person or something like that. And they tend to see the federal government as the enforcer of civil rights and all of these kinds of things. So that's an important reason why the left tends to have a more rosy view of federal law enforcement and a more negative view of local police. There's also the wider view that the left has that most leftists favor the public administration state, the idea of using the government as a tool that can improve society, and then they believe that there needs to be concentrated power for the purpose of reorganizing society around what they consider to be more progressive lines. So all of that fits with this narrative as well. As far as the defund the police thing, most people that use that slogan don't really seem to take it seriously. In the sense of literally wanting to do away with police departments. There are anarchists and others from the extreme left that believe that. But from what I can tell, it's mostly about shifting the focus while not putting as much money into policing, or maybe rolling back policing and putting more effort into things like homeless shelters and substance abuse treatment and social welfare programs, and trying to eliminate what they think are the root causes of crime and urban decay and things like that. I think that's a big part of what defunding the police is supposed to be about. They also have this idea of shifting certain functions away from the police, like dealing with mental health issues and traffic enforcement and all of that kind of stuff. That's another part of defunding the police. So it's a slogan that I think is kind of misleading. Most of the people who use that don't really seem to take it seriously. But I do agree, though, that there's going to be police of some kind. And what typically happens in societies like what the United States is becoming, where you have huge divisions between rich and poor, and a highly fragmented society along cultural or ethnic or political or some other kind of lines, is that, all we need to do is go to Latin America to take a look at this. In Latin America, the way it works is that the wealthy areas of cities have their own police. They have private police, security guards, that you have mercenaries who work for private entities to protect their property. And then you have the police, the conventional police, are mostly just a protection racket. In the sense that, if you commit a crime, if you pay them enough money in a bribe, you can get away with it. And the police are usually completely incompetent when it comes to enforcing actual laws against actual crimes. And in places like that, you typically have very high crime rates. Violent crimes like murders and robberies and that kind of stuff. And in some of these places, you have the army being utilized as a means of quelling civil unrest. A good example are our neighbors in Mexico. That's exactly how Mexico works. In Mexico, here's an illustration. I spent some time in a Mexican city once, and the way it worked is that there was a mountain range through the middle of the city. And on the coastal side, this was in the state of Guerrero on the Pacific coast area of Mexico. On the coastal side was a touristy area. And this is where the more upper middle class people, as well as expatriates from mostly from North America and Europe, lived. And that area was generally very nice. Most of the time, it was relatively safe. Um, and then on the other side of the mountain range, that's where all the very poor people live. And this is third world poverty, not American poverty. And so you had all these shanties and all this kind of stuff. And that area was controlled by a cartel, and there was essentially no law enforcement in that area. You had an issue with the police, the municipal police in this particular city, where at one point there had been a bunch of students going out and doing a protest, just like they do here. Only there, the city police showed up and opened fire and killed 45 people at one point. This happened while I was there. Not long after that, they shut down the police department and hired a new police department, thinking they were going to purge all the rogues that were part of the previous police department. Well, this new police started shaking down tourists for bribes and things like that in the touristy area. The business interest in the tourist business, and then the Mexican government, national government, got upset about that because they're so dependent on tourist money for their economy. So the Mexican federal government sent out the army, the federales. They sent those out and deployed them in the city at strategic points for the purpose of monitoring the police. And I used to literally see this. You'd walk past a guy standing on a street corner holding an AK-47 in military fatigues. When I first started seeing those guys, when I first went there, I was like, what's this about? And people are like, oh, they're just here to watch the police. Like, they have a lot of problems with police, committing crimes. So they have the army here to police the police. And this literally happened. And this is not uncommon. I mean, if you go to Guatemala, it's even worse. In Guatemala, you see people standing around with machine guns, and they're there to prevent a riot from happening or something like that. So that is the kind of model you're going to have. You're not going to get a model where you have a bunch of social workers who double as cops. If you start rolling back policing in this conventional sense of, say, the local police departments, you have the sheriff that's elected, and then you have a police chief that's appointed by a city council typically. If you do away with that model, what you're going to get are more private police. As Todd said, you're going to have civil unrest, and you're going to get the National Guard or even the regular army being deployed. Trump wanted to send out the army to quell the riots in the United States last year. He was actually overruled by the Department of Defense. They just said, no, we're not doing it. So there's the idea that the whole defund the police thing is going to result in something like anarchists would envision, where we have protection services, or simply community cooperatives, or like anarcho-capitalism, where it's all fee for service, police forces or something like that. That's not going to happen. I mean, what you're going to get is exactly the scenario Todd described, where there's less public police, at least at the local level, more reliance on federal agents, on the National Guard, on the military, on mercenaries, on private police forces that work directly for private companies, and all of that.
Yeah, Swithun, what are some of your thoughts on this? You're like, yeah, bring on private security.
That's an interesting point. And a general point when it comes to private security in general, they have a very bad reputation in general. And I think rightly in many cases, because a lot of private security, and especially private prisons, they aren't really a private system in any way, shape or form. It's just sort of a contracted out government service. So the crucial thing comes to me is who is the customer in this case. And some of the private police, in principle, I think are going to be, in principle, are okay. Although what you need is a coherent, for any sort of peaceful society to take place, you need a broad cultural, ethnic, religious, or whatever sort of value system, which means that the people in that geographical area are, broadly speaking, going to get on. And policing is a way of sweeping up sort of fringe elements who are unmutual, as it were. Once you get to a situation where you have mass divisions in certain areas, I mean, sort of policing function as you would envisage in that sort of area doesn't really happen in the way that you would like. It almost ends up in sort of like a low-level civil war situation, as opposed to sort of like genuine sort of policing, a sort of a more coherent body of people. So I mean, I see as well with a lot of the private police, depending who funds them, it's going to be about just defending their own class interests against somebody else. It's not going to be, well, we're doing this just to deal justice in any meaningful sense. Whilst it might, and if it is the case that private police don't have, what's it called? One of the immunity things, I can't remember what it's called, that the police have, which basically gets them off loads of crimes that they do. I can't remember what it's called. If they don't have that, then that'd be a step forward. But yeah, as I say, I'm dubious as to how the how the actual courts will play out with that. On the defund the police movements and sort of paying more to social workers, etc., I actually think that could take place in tandem with an increased heavy militarized sort of internal security system, in that it ticks all the therapeutic boxes that crime is an illness. Crime isn't done by people who just want your stuff and they don't care about you, and that's bad. It's it's a product of that upbringing. It's also social determinism. And so, paying more to community projects, etc., fits perfectly with that and can expand the sort of therapeutic welfare state. And, if it's the case that the streets get more violent, well, that just means more money to military contractors and the federal government to enforce law in sort of lawless parts of America. So I think both things could take place in tandem, and are to the benefit, as it were, of the current ruling class and the state in general. Now, Todd, you made an interesting point that you thought America basically lived under a form of martial law already. I mean, the interesting thing as to why people don't realize that is probably because of how militarized the police themselves have become over the years. I mean, there was an interesting Tom Woods episode with a guy called Christopher Coyne, showing how overseas adventurism and all the tactics they used in the military over there were then brought back over into domestic police tactics. And I think from the war of terror, the war on terrorism, after that especially. Also in sort of Britain, our police are significantly less militarized than the Americans. They routinely they have special firearms officers. They don't routinely carry machine guns, etc., or any sort of weaponry. But the way the British police are going is within that more militarized manner, and you've seen greater levels of heavy sort of security things, sort of post 9/11. I mean, it was you wouldn't have I don't remember going to an airport before September the 11th in England where you'd see any sort of police security with machine guns. They simply didn't exist. But ever since then, they have, and it's all just sort of been ramped up since there. And also, they've got. We tried to bring in something similar civil asset forfeiture in England as well, which I think does now take place, which previously didn't happen more than, say, 20 years ago. Now, I suppose that's a slightly separate topic. I'm deviating. But I think one of the reasons why it's not obvious that you live under a military martial law is just how militarized the police themselves have become. which has been sort of cheered on by the right in general, which has all kind of played into this. Well, no, I suppose that's more of a police state. But I mean, if you say people don't recognize martial law, I mean, people are very loath to say, oh, no, we live under even a police state when you can be arrested for leaving your house. It seems somewhat, I mean, how should we say, the sheep have a bad shepherd. I think that is the current way of things.
All right, terminal philosophy. What are some of your thoughts on this?
Right. Well, there's a bit to respond to there, but right, one thing that was really interesting to me was just the variety of public and sort of media reactions to this. They've been sort of fairly predictable on the part of the right and the left, as far as I can see. As far as on the left, the left said fairly predictable things like, well, the system is still racist. Nothing has changed. America is still as racist as it was in, the 1950s or the 1700s. I guess it doesn't really matter for some of those folks, but the reactions from people like Greg Gutfeld and Nancy Pelosi and others are about as vacuous as one could imagine. I mean, Gutfeld said that he's glad that Chauvin was convicted, even if he's not guilty of them, uh, just out of the desire to bring about some level of peace in his neighborhood. So, I mean, there's there's a whole there's a whole lot that to discuss there. And Nancy Pelosi's odd speech, where she basically thanked George Floyd for dying because it was basically this big political opportunity for Democrats. So the politicization of the legal system will not likely bode well for many people living in places like Detroit, Baltimore, and East LA, and parts of DC and other places, because many police over time become more pensive about enforcing laws in certain neighborhoods, because if there's the right type of atmosphere where the media and social media is constantly portraying you as a murderer, all cops are the same, the cops are like the Borg from Star Trek, there's no such thing as an individual police officer, they're all cops are bastards type of a thing. So yeah, I mean, it's becoming more quasi religious, and I just think that can potentially bode not very well for people living in a lot of those more troubled areas of those cities, because if police become more pensive, well then you might have more lawlessness in those areas. That maybe not, but that could I could see that being the case. um, Now, I've never really thought of myself as a pro-police person in a general sense. I do appreciate the work that goes into law enforcement, and it's probably one of the most thankless jobs in the universe, along with janitors and line cooks and so on. I mean, there are so many various demands placed upon the average police officer, regardless of. Just as kind of a quick anecdote, but regardless of what you think of Sam Harris, he actually had a pretty good episode with his firearms instructor and former LA police officer and SWAT operator, a guy named Scotty Reitz, I believe. Um, Sam Harris asked Reitz to walk him through a fairly typical day for a cop in LA, and he basically listed about a dozen completely um, unrelated and intensive and stressful tasks that had to be completed. So again, while I'm not a Republican or a generic pro-police person, I mean, policemen are basically expected to be, high-speed pursuit driving experts and incredible shots with a pistol or rifle, a quick thinking legal advisor on the ground, just have mythical levels of patience with various troubled people or undesirable people of society, be willing to be screamed at daily, in these tense, difficult situations by people who might perceive you as a murderer and so forth. So, again, society places a lot of demands on police officers, and sometimes it's not a terrible surprise that things like this do happen, where civilians end up dying, or homeless people, or people that are addicted to drugs end up in these difficult situations with policemen. So yeah, that's I think that's a difficult issue, and there's a lot to go into that. I think, as to Todd's larger point, for about the left sort of quietly embracing sort of this corporate superstructure, I think one of the most compelling reasons is that it's by and large probably easier and just logistically more logical to simply subvert the system over time throughout decades or sort of a century-long project than it is to sort of in a revolutionary sense destroy everything and start from scratch. Now, the left, quote unquote, is a huge term and a huge concept, and not everyone on the left agrees with each other. So that can't be stated enough. So I think there are still plenty on the left and many left-leaning socialists who still have uh, revolutionary desires for the West and to turn the United States into some sort of a socialistic state. But by and large, I think the mainstream left notices that the possibility of, it's tough to say. The term late stage capitalism is kind of just another sort of, it seems to be sort of like a preachy thing. I mean, I don't really see capitalism going anywhere. I kind of see it turning into something else, maybe a type of post capitalism or a type of neo feudalistic type of a thing. But I think all that big money is here to stay, and so it's just going to morph into something else. And so I think if you're on the mainstream left, like some of these people like Chomsky and plenty of others, I think they just see the project as that this sort of century-long project. It's just easier to subvert these institutions rather than start from scratch. Like like it's just after the Red Revolution, you've got all these big 5-year plans type of a thing. I think it's just easier to just change the paint job on all the on all the government buildings and all the infrastructure. Um, yeah, I think one other thing I was going to say is that, oh yeah, and Keith was mentioning earlier too. I think a fairly good point that a lot of, even a lot of people on the left don't seem to take the term defund the police very seriously, um, and I think for good reason too, because even though there is a lot of animosity against the police, in various urban areas. The demographic of middle-aged to older African Americans in the United States have a much higher approval of police than younger African Americans. So that's something to keep in mind. I mean, they like having the police around their neighborhoods because it brings some sort of level of peace to the area. So it's complicated and frustrating.
All right, so we're nearing the end of the stream, so we'll start with the final statement. So, what will be your final statements, Keith?
Well, these are pretty complicated issues. We've only started to scratch the surface as far as some of the issues that are involved in these questions. But I think there's a lot of different things that intersect when we start looking at the issue of policing. Um, from a historical perspective, what has been the case is there's been a convergence of a lot of different things that have created the present situation. Back in the early 60s, crime was at an all-time low in the United States. Now, we can debate about why that was or look at the evidence for why that was. But in the period between the late 60s up through the early 90s, we saw a dramatic escalation in crime in the United States and homicide rates and violent crime on a general level. People on the right widely attributed that to the view that courts and police and all that had gotten to be too lenient when it came to crime. What they would do is they would point to liberal Supreme Court rulings in the 60s and 70s that expanded due process rights for accused people, like the right to a public defender, the expansion of the exclusionary rule, the Miranda warning that the police have to read you your rights before they interrogate you. And a lot of conservatives would say, well, see, we gave criminals more rights, and look what happened. We've got all this crime going on. I think that's a greatly oversimplistic view of what actually happened. But it did resonate well with a lot of the public. And I think that in turn led to a shift in the 90s, the 80s and 90s and on into the 21st century, where the emphasis was on throw the book at criminals. So that's how we got 3 strikes laws and mandatory minimums and SWAT teams and all that kind of stuff. I think that I personally believe that one of the reasons why homicide rates became so expansive in the 70s and 80s had to do with the proliferation of the drug trade, which was in turn fueled to a large degree by the war on drugs that Nixon and then later Ronald Reagan implemented, that had the impact of making the drug trade much more profitable, and that made it much more violent and competitive and all of that. So I think that's an issue that's often overlooked, but was an important aspect of it. But what will often happen when there are complaints about policing, usually as applied to poor Black urban communities, is this. Typically, you'll have phases where, okay, there's a lot of complaints about police brutality, and that ends up with a police pullback. The police will pull back. Then you'll start to see an escalation of crime rates. And then there'll be calls either by people in the community or outside for more policing and more aggressive policing and stricter laws and that kind of thing. And then that'll lead to more police brutality and things like that. So it's always kind of a cycle that's involved in this kind of thing. And I think one issue is this. Regardless of what model of policing you prefer, whether you prefer public police or private police or local police or federal police, or whether you think the police should be a private business or a co-op or a citizens militia or a posse or neighborhood watch or nonprofit organization or something, whatever type of police you have, government, anarchist, whatever, corporate, philanthropic, policing ultimately is about giving some people the power to carry weapons and go out and physically apprehend or restrain other people and potentially kill them, depending on the circumstances. So that's a power that needs to be used very cautiously, very sparingly. I don't think replacing government police with private police is of itself a panacea. Private police can be abusive and all of that as well. You still have policemen who are human beings who have all the standard problems human beings have. They can still have weapons and potentially kill somebody or something like that. That would be true of the kind of nonprofit, cooperative community policing that some of the left anarchists favor as well. Same issue there. In fact, that was one of the issues with the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman case. That was not a police issue, and it wasn't even private police. George Zimmerman was a neighborhood watch guy. So I think that's the first problem with policing. You're talking about a situation where some people have the authority to physically restrain or apprehend others, possibly even killing them under particular circumstances. So in what situation is someone going to be authorized to do that? How much power should policing have? And then how should the person who is put in that position, where you're the police person, how much training and responsibility should you have? One criticism I have of American police departments is that the standards for becoming a cop are practically zero in some jurisdictions. You get somebody who has maybe a high school education, if that, and send them to police academy for 3 months, where most of that time they're running and doing firearms training and hand-to-hand combat training. And then they give them a few classes on procedural rules. Well, this is how you read somebody their rights and all of that. And then when they will put them in the field, often they will put them in an area where they are not culturally compatible with. Like you'll get some Joe Redneck guy from the country and put him in the middle of the housing project area or something like that, or in some way where the police have no knowledge of the local culture where they're policing. Also, the training. One of the things that was going on with this Chauvin guy was a couple of the other cops that are involved in this case were actually people that he trained. Right. So now Chauvin had been on the Minneapolis Police Department for almost 20 years and had something like 17 disciplinary actions against him. Right. So you had a guy of dubious character or quality training other rookie police officers. So I think a big part of that is the training. Is whoever in society is going to be authorized to carry weapons and go apprehend other people needs to there needs to be a serious thought given to what circumstances that can be allowed under, and the person who is authorized to do that has to be somebody that is qualified and competent and knows what they're doing. I tend to think that in some of the European countries, they have much higher standards for police membership in the police department. It's the equivalent of a graduate degree in some places, and I suspect that may be a better way to go, because it's a way of screening out people of low intelligence, low character, low competence, and all of that.
All right, Swithun Dobson, final thoughts.
They're going the graduate route in England, although the reason for that seems primarily to be so that they are of good ideological stock more than anything else. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, whilst I understand the reasoning Keith has presented, at least at present, the graduate doesn't seem to be the best idea in any way, shape, or form. Riffing off Keith's, I think one of the key things when it comes to policing in general is everything would be a lot better if you had if the policing system was designed around prevention of crime rather than merely reacting to it. Because if you prevent it, then there aren't any easy situations to deal with because they don't arise to start with. And certainly in England, that went away when this is what Pete Hitchens writes extensively about, that the foot patrols disappear, and because back then we just had unarmed police who just walked on their own around to deter and prevent crime. Went to a more reactive model, then you have a situation to deal with. Another thing I would say here as well is I think what is underlooked is personal protection. Police, you're going to need, I can see the division of labor, etc., etc. is going to be useful here with certain professionals skilled in certain aspects. But if individuals are allowed to defend themselves more, and were encouraged to do so, then the costs of engaging in crime against anybody are going to be a lot higher, because that either the guy you're going to deal with is armed or is at least somewhat competent, or other people in the area are going to be, and that helps with the overall deterrence of crime, rather than, and this is on a very relatively low level. This doesn't require like everyone to be carrying like submachine guns with them. But I think a bigger emphasis on personal protection in general would be a way of minimizing the requirement of having certain people with extra powers, which of course can be abused, as Keith pointed out.
All right, terminal philosophy, you get the last word.
All right. Well, I think the only thing I'll say here is that so much of American life has been repoliticized in the way that it was in the 1960s and 70s. Culture, whether it's in the real world or on the internet, seems to dictate the ethos of many aspects of political life in America. So, to wrap a bow around that point, we'll have to find cultural ways to discourage politicizing trials like this. We'll have to make politicizing trials like this a bad thing, an unpopular thing, or an uncool thing, or something like that. And I tend to agree with Keith's earlier point in the sense that the requirements for police candidates across the United States are, probably way too low, and their training period is arguably way too short. I remember a previous roundtable episode where you guys were discussing the police, and I can't remember the subject, but Todd brought up a case where a policeman was fired for either being too overqualified, or I don't know if it had to do with an IQ score, but it was something truly bizarre and kind of jaw-dropping. But I'll if I find that, I'll drop the link to that in the comment section here. But yeah, I think police need longer training periods, because again, with my previous comment with Sam Harris's episode with his firearms instructor Scotty Reeds, I mean, if you take someone with about an average intelligence, and then you train them for several months on about 24 different things, including like high speed pursuits and and shooting and being physically fit to run down people, being an Usain Bolt, and then also being an extremely patient and likable and approachable person, and then having the sort of fortitude, to go to a parent's house to tell them that their son or daughter's been killed in a car wreck, and then go off to a trial, to stand trial for, to be like a witness for a trial for several hours. And, and lawyers will say things to certain cops like, well, why didn't you shoot the gun out of his hand? Or why couldn't you have just, why couldn't you just have, done some, Deus Machina, or, or some type of action movie move to defeat this guy? They're basically just, placing some impossibility upon some officer. So again, there's about a million different things that policemen have to be really good at, or otherwise they are they're subject to potential events like this. So again, I've never been this pro police person, but we do need a longer training periods for them. They probably need better pay, and they honestly, they probably need a bit more vacation away from police work. I'm not saying that all police candidates need to be competent in Hegel and Foucault and all that, but they need to. They definitely need longer training periods. And there's one gentleman in the chat here saying that it was in Connecticut or in Rhode Island, the applicant had too high of an IQ score for the PD. Yeah, that's right. So, and again, Todd and Keith, you guys were discussing this, and I believe Swithun, you were part of that one too. But yeah, I mean, stuff like that should not be happening. So anyways, without rambling too much further, thanks for having me as always, and I'll see you in the next one.
Yeah, so thanks again, Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, Terminal Philosophy. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.